Excellent. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I am from Sydney, Australia, which is a fair way away, but it's certainly been wonderful to spend some time in Korea and to meet some of you in person. Today, I'm here to discuss the topic of operational technology, or OT for short. Now, this is a topic that certainly has become front of mind for many organizations. There are many different influences on this landscape, and I'm incredibly keen to share some insights with you as to some of the things that we are seeing and how we're responding through Fortinet and our technology partners. Many of you will be familiar with Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law dictates that anything that can happen or can go wrong will go wrong. Certainly, I think that's a bit of a negative mindset. I prefer the concept that anything that can happen will happen. And through that, we need to proactively plan. So please keep that in mind as we go through today's short journey together, because I think it's incredibly important to maintain a positive mindset. So let's have a look at what an OT network actually looks like. Many of you will be familiar with different industry sectors that we rely on to facilitate goods and services, many of which we can often take for granted. Now, historically, the way that we have facilitated these services within different industry sectors has been to adopt this concept of what is known as an air gap. Now, this concept of an air gap ultimately preserves the critical components that are operating in a perfect symphony to facilitate the generation or the distribution of a good or a service. And we can think of it through three key layers. So normally we begin with very rudimentary devices, very simple devices. That might be a pump, a valve, a switch. Those devices ultimately have sensors attached that send telemetry and data to a SCADA server or even a HMI, more commonly known as a human-machine interface. And what that will do is it will allow engineers to proactively monitor critical systems that are part of manufacturing or distribution, but more importantly, allow them to react and invoke changes within that network in a secure manner. We've also seen that the IT network has grown in influence and requires some level of interactivity to pull that telemetry out of an OT network. A big part of that has really been driven by competitive advantage. We know that when you have real-time data, you can make informed strategic decisions that are well placed to make you more competitive. So with this concept in mind, why is it that we are continuing to see an increase in compromised OT networks? Why is it that we're continuing to see disruption within these networks? It's important to call out that when we strive to obtain real-time telemetry out of these OT networks, we are introducing risk. And what we've seen through this process is that the voice of the customer has assisted us to dictate what our product roadmap needs to align to help them to adopt these new concepts of convergence. So, from a broader scale, we know that these systems and these devices are now being compromised. We know that the feedback from the global community is now reflecting that as well. Many of you will be familiar with the World Economic Forum. It's a way of gathering and talking about what's in the best interests of national sovereignty, geopolitical and economic growth. For the first time ever, respondents to a survey based on the top global risks anticipated, critical infrastructure and cyber attacks, also not to neglect operational technology networks, really were front and center. And again, this was the first time that we actually saw this take place, the first time that technology or technological impacts on economic sustainability and growth was actually a key risk. The other interesting factor that I think is important to look at is, as cybersecurity professionals, many of us are deeply in tune with the state of where threat actors are compromising organizations, where they're putting their time, energy, and effort. So it's not surprising to see that 93% of cybersecurity experts anticipate there's going to be some form of catastrophic cybersecurity attack within the next 2 years. What I find very fascinating here is that business leaders are also majority of agreement. So it's an interesting time where we're really seeing these two groups coming together on their thought process on where investment needs to be made. Now, a big reason why OT is so important to address and look at historically is where can we obtain lessons learned. We know that there is an increased level of persistence for threat actors to compromise these networks. We know that there's a broad plethora of reasons as to why threat actors are targeting OT. It may simply be for financial reasons. They might want to profiteer. They may want to steal and exfiltrate intellectual property, which they can sell to the nearest competitor. It might be for geopolitical reasons. It may even be for a hacker or a subgroup to build some form of credibility within the community they are part of. So when we look at this, I think the key takeaway that's very important for all of these incidents that are in front of you is disruption leads to downtime. Downtime leads to revenue loss, and revenue loss leads to irreversible brand damage. And when we look at some of the statistics behind that, from some of our partners, we've seen that the average cost of operational downtime per hour is about $500,000 US. Within Australia, so from where I'm based out of, we have what's known as the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, where organizations are required to report critical incidents. We've seen more than 57,500 incidents reported in the last year. That's 1 every 7 minutes. And that equates to more than $33 billion worth of self-reported losses. More importantly, more than a quarter of those incidents are associated with critical infrastructure. So the threat is real. We've seen historically how OT networks have been compromised. But more importantly, we want to paint a positive picture as to how we're applying appropriate control points and a strategy to ensure that these OT organizations can adopt change and they can obtain a stronger level of competitive nature. So what we've outlined here is some of the key things that are certainly front of mind. And these are from observations that we've made based on feedback collected from our customers as well. We know that most of the legacy hardware that is deployed within these OT networks, these PLC systems, the moving componentry, they did not and they never have had cybersecurity built in by design. Therefore, they are highly susceptible to vulnerabilities that are either discovered or they're ripe for exploitation. We've also seen the attack surface is expanding. So there are many environments that you can walk into and they will say they've got a preserved air gap when in fact there are many engineers or external contractors that actually have a direct way of obtaining access into that OT network. And that might be to ensure that there's a specific product that's maintained to a certain patch level. It might be for the hardware vendor that's present within your environment to pull telemetry out for their own competitive advantage to see how they can optimize their own product. Remote access is certainly a key component of what's incredibly important. I think when we look at this, we know that within IT enterprise organizations, most end users are either in the office or they're working from home. For OT, a lot of organizations operate out of very remote or even hostile locations. And with that, we need secure ways of accessing those sites in a prompt manner. So these are some of the factors that come into play. These are some of the challenges that we're observing. Now, to reinforce that, it's also evident that we need a shared approach, a community-based approach. Now, the convergence of IT and OT, again, can net some phenomenal benefits, but it's incredibly important that we have the capabilities to do that in a secure manner. Now, one of the key factors that we look at from a cybersecurity perspective is how we can mitigate disruption. In order to mitigate disruption, we need to look at why these OT organizations and these networks are being compromised. I'm sure that many of you are highly fatigued of hearing about ransomware. However, unfortunately, it's still ever present. We have observed the number of variants for ransomware almost double within the last 6 months. And the levels of motivation are becoming more aggressive. One area that I think is often neglected is wiper malware. So if we look at ransomware, the sole purpose is generally for profiteering. Wiper malware, the sole purpose is to invoke disruption. If you have wiper malware that ends up in an OT network, it will specifically go and delete and terminate critical files, folders, and directories associated with running that infrastructure. Now, you might think that that's simply a manufacturing plant. However, if you apply that message to an energy generation or an energy distribution facility, that can have massive real-world consequences that can even lead to serious injury or even death. One of the things that Fortinet has proactively been working on with our technology partners, including Schneider, Honeywell, Yokogawa, is looking at the vulnerabilities. So we know that there are many vulnerabilities within the OT space. And we also know that unlike the IT network, we cannot simply go out and patch them. Because if we patch them, it's invoking operational downtime and again, potentially revenue loss. So in the interest of being open and in candor, I've redacted the brands here, but each one of these color codes is associated with a processor or a control vendor. And what this highlights is the number of vulnerabilities that are currently present and continuing to expand within these networks. So that might be a PLC, a programmable logic controller, that's been sitting within a manufacturing network for more than 15 years. It hasn't been patched. If it is behind an air-gapped network, maybe the risk is minimal, right? But we know that these air-gapped networks are beginning to diminish, and therefore these vulnerabilities are suddenly becoming publicly accessible via the internet. So it's an area of tremendous concern, but fortunately, through the FortiGate, we have the capability to apply virtual patching to mitigate a lot of these vulnerabilities. And we can do that, again, at the network layer to prevent disruption to the network. So when we look at APAC and we look at some of the drivers for investment into OT cybersecurity, it's quite important that we look at what's really driving good OT cyber hygiene, but also governance, risk, and compliance, and legislation. If we look at Australia, Singapore, India, many of the government initiatives are to actually ensure that organizations are building cyber resilience into their OT networks, especially within their critical infrastructure. So when we look at those three countries and we really bring it back down to the core of what organizations need to accomplish, we know you need asset visibility, right? You need a comprehensive way of seeing all your IT assets, but also all your OT assets. It's also incredibly beneficial to know who your asset owners are. Now, a big part of what we strive to accomplish is the narrative of knowing if there is some form of compromise within your OT network, how can we decipher is this a cybersecurity incident, or is it simply a product that's malfunctioned or even degraded and no longer is functioning in an optimized state? So government legislation has also dictated that there's a requirement now to report any form of incident that's been observed within your critical infrastructure or OT network. Some countries, including Australia, are incredibly aggressive on the time frame required. In 12 hours of identification for a critical incident within a critical infrastructure network, the Australian government expects you to report on that. The final component, which we certainly believe is critical to any investment in operational technology environments, is the proactive activities associated with running end-user awareness training. Many of the people that sit within these OT networks are engineers, they're electricians, they're running physical assets and physical hardware. It's incredibly important to show them what a cybersecurity incident actually looks like. I've historically been a practitioner working with an incident response and walked into many OT environments that had some form of compromise. And when I've walked in there, the mouse is moving around the screen. And the OT engineer just assumed that was the IT side of the business that was actually invoking some form of change, when it was actually a malicious threat actor that was actively doing reconnaissance within their network. So independent of your journey, it's very important to build a very solid blueprint with foundations associated with uplifting your cyber resilience. So with that in mind, I think it's important to kind of look at the way in which OT architecture has historically been built out. Many of you will be familiar with a standard known as IEC 62443. Furthermore, the Purdue model. This is a logical way of breaking up a network to control where traffic flows ultimately. And we can see this based on the left-hand side, right? Now, through digital transformation and the requirement to reach into these OT networks, we have seen there have been a broad range of capabilities required, whether that's hardware, software, or even other componentry within the cloud. And we've seen that these have rapidly accelerated, and suddenly, for many organizations, they're managing many different solutions across this entire journey. A very important part for us is simplifying that for us and simplifying it for our customers so that, again, they can have confidence to adopt best-in-breed solutions that will actually net them the best outcome to mitigating disruption to their network and, again, reducing any form of revenue loss or brand damage. So the way in which we've accomplished this is leveraging the Forti fabric. So the Fortinet security fabric with our partners. Now, we certainly believe that by adopting this kind of framework, this mesh, if you will, it really does reduce the mean time to detection to an incident, but more importantly, it reduces the mean time to response. We know that within IT networks, if you see some form of incident, if you see that there is indeed a variant of ransomware on an end user's laptop, it's quite straightforward, right? I mean, you disconnect the laptop, you shut it off, you reformat it, you re-provision. Within an OT network, you certainly don't have that luxury. In many cases, an OT network can be completely compromised, but you can't shut it down. You've also got to factor in, if you do shut systems down, how long is it going to take to bring those systems back up online? And if that's an energy generation plant or a critical manufacturing facility, that can, again, have very negative real-world ramifications. So what we have done is we've worked with our technology partners. We've worked within our own teams to ensure that we have this fabric approach. We're adopting active ways for beneficial value propositions to be built. We work with organizations like Honeywell, Schneider Electric, Yokogawa, GE, to ensure that we have rich information as to how their assets work. We also work with Clarity, Dragos, Nozomi to get further enriched information on how these assets actually operate and function as well. So when we dig into that a little bit deeper and we overlay that, we've got a very sound structure to approach this challenge. And we've, again, listened to the voice of the customer, which has really dictated this journey. Adopting IEC 62443, looking at the common use cases that certainly do come up. And if I highlight some of these, a lot of it is just good cyber hygiene and best practice. And we can facilitate this through not as many components as many organizations initially anticipate. Segmentation, micro-segmentation. We can work through network access control. Honeywell, about a year ago, released a state of cybersecurity threat report, and they highlighted the #1 reason why OT networks are being compromised is because of USB peripherals being plugged in. So if you can negate that, you're certainly in a far better position. So we have a breadth of different use cases that are certainly front of mind, and we feel that it's very important to build out your journey to understand how am I going to adopt cyber resilience without invoking disruption? How can I build a maturity plan to continue to reinforce my cybersecurity maturity levels? We also have a capability that allows us to take OT assets, like a SCADA terminal or even a pump, and we can digitize that asset, we can deploy it within an OT network, and we can use it as a digital decoy. So if you have a threat actor that attempts to compromise your network, you can actually monitor the activity that they perform during that reconnaissance phase, you can fingerprint it, and then you can build mechanisms in play to prevent that from taking place. And a true and solid foundation for applying a maturity model to your cybersecurity strategy within OT is to break the perception that you are ultimately going to be compromised by a highly sophisticated, well-funded cybersecurity threat actor or syndicate. In many instances, OT organizations are simply compromised by legacy malware that's been around since the 90s. So independent of whether it's a highly sophisticated threat actor or very common commodity malware, the adverse implications and ramifications can be just as drastic. So when we look at addressing this convergence challenge, again, I mentioned some of our key partners. It's fundamental for us that we share insights. We know that in order to alleviate a lot of the strain and the stress associated with cybersecurity threats is to get actionable insights. And again, that's why you'll see major brands up here that many of you will be familiar with, such as Schneider Electric, ABB, Siemens. We do a lot of work with Nozomi Networks, Dragos, again, to pull together a holistic picture of an OT network and obtain comprehensive visibility. We are certainly leaders in this space as well. So independent of what I say here, we're externally referenceable as being very competitive leaders in this space. And more importantly, we have a very broad range of industry verticals within the OT landscape that are willing to be public references for us, where we've come in to assist them and enable them to continue doing what they do at the heart of their journey, whether it's manufacturing, energy generation, water distilling. It's multifaceted. And again, in the interest of covering some of the key use cases that are publicly accessible and we can work through with you, independent of the vertical that you're within, there are many organizations that we have proactively engaged with to ensure that we're uplifting their cybersecurity strategy, but also really hugging the cactus to say, we understand you have issues that you have that are very sensitive, and that might be running legacy operating systems. It may indeed be something where there are remote or hostile locations that they struggle to obtain access to. This is certainly front of mind for us, and we have a portfolio that is fit for purpose. We have ruggedized devices that can be deployed in situations where you may not necessarily anticipate they need to be. So we're holistically looking at the challenge. So what are the next steps? Well, ultimately, we can perform what is known as an operational or an OT assessment. What this does is it sits off a FortiGate. It collects basically traffic, OT-based traffic within your network, and we can build out a bit of a picture as to what activities we can see. Now, within this assessment, what is fundamental is looking at, we know there is IP traffic. So IP traffic, historically encrypted, very difficult to intercept and manipulate. Within OT, the OT landscape, traffic is generally unencrypted, easy to intercept, and easy to manipulate. So this is a good activity that you can do, again, non-invasive. Certainly reach out to the local Fortinet team. We've got Neo here as well, our dedicated OT BD, to kind of support you through that process. In final thoughts, when we're thinking about OT, and kind of key takeaway here is what are the key things that you need to kind of really think about when you think about the OT messaging? We need comprehensive IT and OT-based visibility. We need to ensure that we have non-invasive and highly predictable states of change within the OT landscape. So if we're going to go and apply cybersecurity strategies, we need to ensure it doesn't have adverse implications for the business. We need contextual threat intelligence that is fit for purpose to handle the incidents that we assume are going to target your organization. And then finally, we need very granular control points that are going to allow you to respond to a cybersecurity incident in a way that mitigates operational disruption. So with that, I certainly appreciate your time. It's wonderful to be here. I'd, without question, love to have a conversation with you a bit later. I'll be hovering around, predominantly around the OT booth. But thank you again. I truly appreciate it, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you.